Optimal minimal.
At this altitude, I can run flat out for a half mile before my hands start shaking.
Can I answer your personal question?
Now would seem an appropriate time.
What if I did the opposite?
I'm a cybernetic organism, living tissue over metal endoskeleton.
Tim Ferriss Show.
This episode is brought to you by Peloton. And I'd heard about Peloton over and over again, but I ended up getting a Peloton bike and the whole system after I saw my buddy Kevin Rose. I've known him forever, some of you know, and he showed up at my gate at my house a while back, and he looked fantastic. And I asked him, I said, dude, you look great. What the hell have you been up to? Because he's always doing a weird diet or another, but it only lasts like a week or two. So he always regresses to the mean after like 75 beers. And he said, I've been doing Peloton 5 days a week. Now that caught my attention because Kevin does nothing 5 days a week. And you know I love you, Kevin. But it really piqued my curiosity. Ended up getting a system, and it's become an integral part of my week. I love it, and I really didn't expect to love it at all because I find cycling really boring usually. But Peloton is an indoor cycling bike that brings live studio classes right into your home. You don't have to worry about fitting classes into your schedule or making it to a studio with some type of commute, etc. New classes are added every day, and this includes options led by elite New York City instructors in your own living room. You can even live stream studio classes taught by the world's best instructors or find your own favorite class on demand. And in fact, Kevin and I rarely do live classes, and you can compete with your friends, which is also fun. Kevin, I'm coming after you. But we usually just use classes on demand. I really like Matt Wilpers and his high-intensity training sessions that are shorter, like 20 minutes. And I think Kevin's favorite is Alex, and everyone seems to have their favorite instructor, or you can select by music, duration, and so on. Each Peloton bike includes a 22-inch HD touchscreen, performance tracking metrics. I think that, along with the real-time leaderboard, are the main reasons that this caught my attention when cycling never had caught my attention before. It's really pretty stunning what they've done with the user interface to keep your attention. The belt drive is quiet, and it's smaller than you would expect, so it can fit in a living room or an office. I actually have it in a large closet, believe it or not, and it fits with no problem. So Peloton is offering all of you guys, listeners of the Tim Ferriss Show, a special offer, and it is actually special. Visit One Peloton, that's OnePeloton, onepeloton.com, and enter the code TIM, all caps, TIM, at checkout to receive $100 off accessories with your Peloton bike purchase. Now you might say, meh, accessories? Wait, I don't need fancy towels or whatever other supplemental bits and pieces. No, the shoes you need. You need the clip-in shoes, and those are in the accessory category. So this $100 off is a very legit $100 off. So if you want to get in your workouts, if you want a convenient and really entertaining way to do high-intensity interval training or anything else, or you just want to get a fantastic gift for someone, check out Peloton. OnePeloton.com and enter the code TIM. Again, that's OnePeloton.com and enter the code TIM at checkout to receive $100 off any accessories, including the shoes that you will want to get. Check it out, OnePeloton.com, code TIM. This episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. You may have heard them everywhere. They're growing like crazy. They're an innovative platform for doing several things, but especially improving the hiring process, making it slick and elegant and easy. One of the hardest parts of running any business, growing any business, is finding and hiring the right team. I've seen this firsthand in close to 100 startups now. God, I'm getting old. From all over the world at different stages of growth. And nothing can quite drain your resources and cost you time and money like making mistakes in hiring. ZipRecruiter developed their own system and their own platform for helping you to solve two of the biggest problems and bottlenecks for employers: posting jobs easily and then making it even easier to find the best candidates. Unlike other job sites, ZipRecruiter does in effect the opposite of what you'd expect. So they do not depend on candidates finding you. Their technology finds the right candidate for you. And in fact, more than 80% of the jobs posted on ZipRecruiter return a qualified candidate based on your criteria that you select in just 24 hours. So no more juggling email, reviewing hundreds of unqualified candidates. I've been there, done that. Don't recommend it. Or dealing with calls to the office, etc. None of that. Simply screen, rate, and manage your candidates all in one place on ZipRecruiter's dashboard. And as a listener of the Tim Ferriss Show, thanks for that, ZipRecruiter wants to allow you to start posting jobs and trying their services for free. So if you're thinking of hiring somebody, you need to find an executive assistant, you need to find a developer, whatever it might be. Try it out. Just visit ziprecruiter.com/Tim, and you can experience just how ZipRecruiter has been used by businesses of all different sizes to find the most qualified job candidates. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/Tim. Check it out. Give it a spin. Hello, boys and girls, damas y caballeros. This is Tim Ferriss, and welcome to another episode of The Tim Ferriss Show, where it is my job to deconstruct world-class performers of all different types, to tease out the tactics, habits, routines, and so on that you can use. I am recording this intro at a Mexican airport after a top-secret retreat doing top-secret things, and maybe I'll talk more about that sometime. But this episode you're going to hear is with one of my favorite people, Tim O'Reilly, and I recorded this some time ago and held on to it like a piece of gold to my chest to release at the right time. At Tim O'Reilly on Twitter. He's one of the most fascinating polymaths and autodidacts, one of the most curious minds I've ever encountered. He's been called the trend spotter in the world of tech, and certainly involving wider macro trends. He's been called the Oracle of Silicon Valley. He is the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, Inc. His original business plan was pretty simple. Interesting work for interesting people, and that's worked out pretty well. He's generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue doing many, many different things. O'Reilly Media delivers online learning, publishes books, runs conferences, urges companies to create more value than they capture, and tries to change the world by spreading and amplifying the knowledge of innovators. But as he would say himself, one of my favorite quotes of his, sorry for the noise, this is some audio verite for all of you guys, but he would say, quote, money in a business is like gas in a car. You don't want to run out, but you're not doing a tour of gas stations. And we talk quite a bit about that. Tim has an incredible history of convening conversations that reshape the computer industry. In 93, that's 1993 for you youngins, he launched the first commercial website. That was very Sean Connery, the first commercial website. And then in 98, he organized the meeting where the term open source I've been speaking too much Castellano. My English is not happening. Open source software. My God. Let's try that again. He organized the meeting where the term open source... I swear to God, I'm not drunk, guys. Open source software was agreed on and helped the business world understand its importance. In 2004, with the Web 2.0 Summit, he defined how Web 2.0 represented not only the resurgence of the web after the dot-com bust, but an entirely new model for the computer industry, based on big data, collective intelligence, and the internet as a platform. Web 2.0 is actually one of the conferences where the 4-hour workweek reached its tipping point. So also thank you to Tim for that. In 2009, with his Gov 2.0 Summit, he framed a conversation around the modernization of government technology that has shaped policy and spawned initiatives at the federal, state, and local level and all around the world. He has now turned his attention and is very focused on artificial intelligence, the implications of artificial intelligence, the on-demand economy, and other technologies that are transforming the nature of work and the future shape of the business world. He really has both a 30,000-foot view of the larger shifts, the tectonic shifts that will produce changes in 10, 20, 30 years, but is also on the ground and really in touch with the people who are shaping the details of how that will come to pass. And his brand new book, which I encourage everybody to check out, is WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us? And I will link to all of that in the show notes, of course. And if you liked Kevin Kelly, he is a bird of a feather with this fine gent, Tim O'Reilly. So without further ado, please enjoy this very wide-ranging, extremely, for me certainly, enjoyable conversation with Tim O'Reilly. Tim, welcome to the show. Thank you for making the time.
Well, thanks for having me.
I have been looking forward to this for some time, and most recently, your name came up because I was in a car in the back mountains surrounding part of Uzbekistan with Kevin Kelly. And our friend Kevin Kelly, on a very short list, when I asked him, who do you think I should absolutely have on the podcast? Tim O'Reilly was one of the names that came up. So I also leaned on Kevin for some deep intel and suggested topics and questions. But I thought I would start with what's on everyone's mind, which is, why are you similar to Cookie Monster?
Yes. Well, I often joke about myself, as a VC and a business person, that I'm a little bit like some episode I remember from when my kids were little on Cookie Monster. I may not have this completely right, but he's on a game show. And he has to pick his prize. And behind door number 1 is $1 million. And they tell him that. Behind door number 2 is a chateau in France. And behind door number 3 is a cookie. And of course, everybody knows what he picks. And what I like to say about myself is that I always go for the cookie. Because in some sense, what I really care about, what's my cookie, is finding people who are doing something new and interesting that I think other people want to know about and that they can learn from. And, my whole business has been built around finding people who have cookies and then sharing it with the world.
So not to take the Cookie Monster discussion too far, but you didn't know this. I happened to be standing in a house where seasons 1 through 10 of Sesame Street were partly written. So many of the characters, including Cookie Monster, were actually written where I am standing. So it's come.
Oh, that's amazing.
So it's come full circle. And when I bought the house, they were going to throw everything out. The former owners, including a season 1 staff jacket for Sesame Street, which of course I kept. And that is hanging in the doorway. But when we come back to ideas, and we'll certainly spend a lot of time talking about publishing and many things that are perhaps a little more recent in your life, but I wanted to rewind the clock a bit and to start maybe with an odd story. Could you tell me about how your father, who my understanding was a neurologist, also deeply religious, injected radioactive copper isotopes into your arm? Is that a true story?
That is absolutely true.
So tell me, I need some more context on that.
Actually, it wasn't my dad who injected them. It was a guy named Leroy Shipley. He was the lab tech, and oh my God, he was amazing. He was very funny. But my best friend and I, and my best friend's sisters, when I was 14, the girls were a little older, agreed to participate in a study of Wilson's disease, which is a disease of the abnormal retention of copper in the body. It's a genetic disease. My dad was, sort of a pioneer in early genetic medicine, also radiomedicine, and Wilson's disease was one of his specialties. And so they needed to have control subjects to understand how copper is excreted normally. And so they would inject us with radioactive copper, and then every day we went in and lay in this room with, it was massive thing, it wasn't like today's MRIs, but it was just this whole room that was called a whole body counter. And they kind of traced where the copper went. It accumulates in the liver and then in the brain of people with Wilson's disease, and it's normally excreted after about some relatively small amount of time. So it was copper 64. It's got a half-life of a few weeks, and so presumably it was all gone. But if I ever come down with liver cancer, I may have my father to blame. But we actually did it twice. And again, he obviously took some thought about whether it was safe, because once we became lab rats for him, there were other researchers who wanted us to do other experiments, and he, said, "No, I don't want you to do that one. That doesn't, seem right to me." So he, of course, used himself as a guinea pig for his experiments.
What did your mother do? I mean, you had, as I understand it, 7 children total in the family?
That's correct.
What did that's certainly a full-time job just to take care of the kids, but what did your mom spend her time doing primarily?
I think taking care of 7 kids is huge. I still remember her. One of my memories of my mom is her on her hands and knees in the bathroom scrubbing the toilet. And she looks up and says, life is not a bowl of cherries. But of course, the idea of my mom like that brings up another great story about the time that she likes to tell. She was apparently, up on a piano stool trying to dust a light, and she fell off and was lying flat on the floor. And my brother James, who must have been 8 or 9 at the time, came running in from the schoolyard. We lived about a block from the school, sees her on the floor and says, "Mommy, what time is it?" And she says, "James, I don't know." And he goes, "Okay," and runs back out. And then later she said, "What did you think I was doing lying on the floor?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, maybe dusting under the piano." So she was basically, she was the old school, she made every bit. I kind of look back and I go, she should have made us do more of the work. We had some chores, but basically she made all the beds. She, it was just, it's a lot with 7 kids. And again, of course, I was in the older cohort, so there were still, young babies. And I think the thing that's actually been such a great delight to me in my life, my dad died very young, died at 60, so, and that's now, 40 years back. My mom, later came to travel with me. She would just come with me on my business trips. And she was just such a willing, interested traveler. She was a girl from the back of the mill in Yorkshire, kind of grew up, from her parents and her grandparents before that were factory workers, but her dad was also a bookie. Taking bets on horses back when it was illegal. And so she always would tell us stories which for her were full of shame, but for us were full of romance, of how she used to have to go collect bets from strangers in the park when she was a girl, and the police would come. He'd have to light out over the back fences. So we took great delight in the thought that we were descended from petty criminals. Again, of course, by the time, I was a teenager and went to visit, it was legal, and his son actually had the betting business and a little betting shop. It's a lot of fun. And it actually brings up something that's completely irrelevant, but kind of a bit of pattern recognition. The fact that here was a guy who, had a living doing something that was illegal, and then when it became legalized, he was able to do it. And it made me think of what's happening right now with, with weed in places like California, where it's been legalized. And sorry, I was trying to think. The head of the San Francisco Foundation was over at dinner. And we're talking about various issues, and he says, this is Fred Blackwell. He says, what about the weed problem? I said, what do you mean the weed problem? He says, well, there's all these people coming in now, and they're making all this money selling weed, and the only people who can't participate in this new economy are all the black and brown people who have convictions on their record for selling weed, and it's just that kind of interesting thing that we don't think about, when we change the rules. What do we do about the people who, played by the old rules, the new rules? And that just kind of leads me down the path of a lot of what's broken in our society is, this sort of layering of ideas that change, but they change incompletely. People have this, effectively bad map of the world that doesn't work anymore. And, same kind of thing. And again, a lot of the work that we do at Code for America, my wife's nonprofit, is around, fixing some of these things. We do a lot of work in expunging, low-level, offenses. This is why we were talking with Fred. From people's record, they passed something called Prop 47 here in California. And there was something like $40 million spent to pass this proposition. But the implementation, nobody thought about it. And so a tiny fraction of the people who are eligible have actually done it. And the same thing we saw with the healthcare.gov failure back in 2013. People pass policies and they don't actually think about how are we going to do it? How are we going to actually do this thing? So right now, if you want to clear your record, you have to go get go to the DA's office and you pick up this form and then you go somewhere else and get it signed by someone. And, these are people who don't have the time to go, spend months on this process. If they were going to pass this, they could have thought through how are we going to make this easier for people. And a lot of the work the other work we do, things like we work on improving access to food aid. And we got brought in because they didn't really understand why people were signing up and then falling off the program and then signing up again immediately. And it was just administrative stuff that people didn't know how to comply with. And they didn't have any measurement. In the tech world, people have gotten very used to A/B testing and measuring things and understanding, this is where people are falling out of our pipeline. This is where things don't work. And a lot of what we've ended up building at Code for America are alternate pathways that are designed to teach us about what's wrong. So we're sort of, they're exploratory. Jen, my wife, Jen Palka, calls it apps to ops. We're basically building apps that actually do let us follow the users. So we can say, here, you're losing some number of people because your application takes 45 minutes to fill out. And there are people who are trying to do this in libraries where there's a 30-minute timeout and you have no mechanism for them to save their work. Stuff like that. Or, hey, you're telling people their documents are uploaded successfully, but they're not. Or you're sending out, in some counties, they were sending out, letters about people's appointments that they were supposed to make. And they would come in. They would come out, 25% of them, or some significant fraction, would come out after the date of the appointment. And they didn't know it. That was the worst part. It was bad enough that it was happening, but they didn't know it. And the same thing true. We work a lot with at the federal level under Obama. Jen was deputy CTO and helped set up something called the United States Digital Service. And a lot of the problems at the VA were very similar. People would be applying from library computers, homeless vets, and they couldn't get through the process. And, basically the people in Washington, at the VA headquarters were saying, well, they're obviously not eligible because they're not succeeding. And, they had tested and, the procurement process meant, we have to test this app. But they tested it with a particular combination of Internet Explorer and Adobe software. And that wasn't what was out there in the real world. And it didn't work. And so they went out and just filmed users. And then they were able to go, see, look, it really doesn't work. And in some ways, that's been my life. It's funny because Code for America is sort of a latest incarnation, or one of the latest incarnations of that. But when I was early in my career, it was just like, there's no, doing documentation, writing down the steps. I still remember working with one author on one of our early books, and he said, I can't write this chapter yet. And I said, that's what he said. I said, why? And he said, because the software doesn't work. And I said, that's what you have to write. Because, while you're sitting here not getting this book done, and there's this piece of the software that doesn't work, people are beating their heads against the wall and they think it's them.
True.
So
yeah.
Telling them that it doesn't work is actually the documentation that's needed right now.
So I want to underscore something. So this question of how can we make X easier for people, or why isn't Y easier for people? And I do want to rewind just a little bit, because I and many people are very interested in how you think and how that leads to, for instance, identifying edges. I mean, you've been a great pioneer on the edge of many different frontiers. So I want to go back to not necessarily the bookie, but to ask what, well, first of all, this is just personal curiosity. What do your other siblings do these days as professions, or any examples?
Well, let me kind of go through my oldest brother has had a pastiche of careers. He owns a small fleet of taxi cabs where he's been competing with Uber and Lyft, and kind of fulminating against the taxi system. He would like to be able to operate like Uber and Lyft and can't. And he also runs a business reselling used books, including mine, on Amazon. So he's kind of unfortunately he's dealing with two very declining industries, my next brother has run a small publishing company that I started with him called Traveler's Tales, which basically was a story-based approach to travel. Rather than guidebooks which tell you, what to do. It was more like people sharing their experiences, so you could go, oh yeah, that sounds like exactly what I want, as opposed to kind of the catalog approach. And so he's been a travel writer for many years. And then all of my sisters have basically have raised families. Although it's interesting, a very heavy percentage of homeschooling in my family, and so they've been teachers as well as parents. My younger brother Frank is a builder. In college, he basically built a house to live in and never looked back. It was like when I think it was a junior, he and a friend built the house that they went and lived in, and then they went, this was great. So they rented it to some other students, and then built another one over the summer and lived in that. And then, anyway, so he started and it's kind of funny because he's really built. He still lives near the college he lived in. And he's built, the church, the school, the library, the homes that many of the people live in, and he now has, kind of a business that's a rental business. There's some actually fabulous places he's built on the Shenandoah River that he rents. And it's kind of interesting because he's actually been a lot like me in that he built his business just intuitively from the ground up by following his nose. And what was so interesting, though, when we were growing up, if you had asked my mom, she would have said that Frank and I were the most dissimilar.
Why is that?
Well, because, I was always the top student in school, and he was, he got D's and F's, and, and my brothers and I were always saying, no, he just isn't interested, because we would see him at home, when he was 10 years old, he got totally obsessed with the Civil War, and he'd read, he was reading Bruce Catton and all the history, he had lots and lots of history, and, and setting up these enormous recreations of battles of the Civil War. And we went, he's just not interested in school, and so, it was just sort of interesting watching. He's 7 years younger than I am, but watching him kind of have the same path of building his own business, creating a lot of value for the people around him, and pivoting as necessary. He got into the even though he started with this sort of rental thing in college, he was basically building and selling homes. And then after the 2008 financial crisis, nobody would finance, homes unless you had cash. So but you could borrow for a business property. So he ended up, building, he had these lots and he started building places and renting them, and he actually got pretty good at it. So he has a variety of businesses and
What advice would you give to a parent who has a kid currently like your brother, who's clearly very, very bright, but just doesn't seem to be interested in school and therefore is getting poor grades? What would you say to someone like that, a parent in that position?
It's sort of a tough one because sometimes you do have to push kids. I think the main thing, and this is true whether you're a parent with your kids or whether you're, a business person or just somebody trying to solve problems in your own life, is having an attitude of receptivity and openness and really looking and understanding what's going on. I mean, at the end of the day, there are no recipes. And so many problems come from people following recipes or following maps that don't match the reality. And, frank, didn't match the recipe of what you were supposed to do in school, but it was pretty clear he was following his own path. Same thing's true of I have two daughters, and one of them, school was easy. She always did well. The other one, not so well, but she was like totally following her own path. And she's become this amazing sound artist. She's an artist in residence at the Exploratorium, created, an iPhone app for something called Rhythm Necklaces, this different way of visualizing, rhythm. She's sort of exploring medieval hockets, and she's, scored stuff for, Bjork's Biophilia tour, and, created, these sort of, all these sort of odd musical instruments, just totally built her own, curiosity-driven path into the world. And so the thing I guess I would just say is, like, look at your kid. There's a wonderful book. I forget the name of the author. It's called Loving Every Child. And it's about a guy in Nazi Germany. He basically had two schools, and one was for children of sort of wealthy Germans, and then the other was a segregated school for Jews. And when they came to take his Jewish kids, he went with them, and died in the concentration camp. And funny how we can forget those things. But anyway, the point of the book is love your children, look at them, understand them, and listen to them. And the thing that I think, treat them as people. I mean, a lot of people treat their kids as objects. I've been in a room with people where they talk about their kids when they're there as if they don't listen. They're not there, or they just, so kids are on show, or they're, told what to do. And it's like, treat them like you would want to be treated, and I guess I felt like I did my best, and as a parent, parenting is a hard job, to just be there with your kids and talk with them and listen to them.
What are there any questions that you like to ask your kids a lot? Are there any or questions that you've taught them to ask themselves? This might seem like a non sequitur, but it's what came to mind for me. Mm-hmm.
It's a good, I wish I had an easy answer to it, and I don't.
That's okay. I don't have kids, so I don't have any answers to it.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that this is not a question, but there's one piece of life advice that I give in the form of a quote. It's from a psychiatrist named Irvin Yalom, who was also a novelist, and he wrote a novel called When Nietzsche Wept, which is an imagined story of early psychoanalysis, actually pre-Freud. There was a guy who was a predecessor to Freud, and it's basically him analyzing Nietzsche. And there's this one line in it that really stuck in my head, as lines do sometimes from books, and it was, first will what is necessary, and then love what you will. And, it does have to do with the one thing that I think we do have to teach our children. Well, there's a lot of things we have to teach our children. But one of them is that everything doesn't come easily. And there's some things that you have to do that you don't want to do. And one of the secrets of success in life is, to first, will those things and then come to love them. And you think about that with exercise, a great example. Once it's like it's hard to get started, but once you get into it, it becomes a joy. And there are a lot of things that are like that. Doing the dishes, cleaning the house, looking after other people, and so sort of understanding, having an understanding of what your responsibilities are. and then working at them, if necessary, with will until they become something that you love, is just an incredibly useful piece of life advice.
So I'm definitely going to want to come back and talk about what you have personally found difficult or difficult moments. But I want to ask about a decision that you made, and this is transitioning from a classics degree to writing technical manuals, for lack of a better descriptor. You could certainly give some more context, but how did that happen, and why did you decide to trend in that direction?
Well, it was pretty simple. First of all, let me give a little context for the classics. I had worked in the early 70s when I was actually just even a teenager with a guy named George Simon, who had developed this theory about the evolution of consciousness, and also about sort of an experiential approach to kind of inner spiritual growth. I could kind of go into it in more detail, but one of his ideas was that there had been this profound evolution of consciousness over time. And there was a sort of a historical arc to it, and that we were in a period of sort of individuation that had really begun in classical Greece. There are actually books like Bruno Snell's The Discovery of the Mind, where you can kind of see this, that when they talk about, in Homer, Odysseus doesn't decide to do something. Athena puts this idea into his thumos, his liver,
right,
and he acts. And then by the time 400 years later, when you're reading about Socrates, you're seeing them wrestling with these ideas that really are at the heart of, what is truth, what is justice, what is what is happiness, and by the way, that was sort of the subject of my thesis in classics, was really about. It was about mysticism and logic in Plato, because they would kind of talk about, these mystical passages, he must have been influenced by the Orphics. And I'm like, no, these things that we now kind of rehearse, like ideas of justice, they were incredibly new and powerful. And yes, they felt like, these mystical kind of things that they were wrestling with. But I digress. But so the reason I was interested in classics was deeply connected with George's theory, because I was into we're now entering into, he had this idea that we were entering into this new phase of global consciousness. And there's a real irony, because my long detour into tech turned out not to be a detour at all, because who would have thought that, I'm trying to think how much longer, 30 years later, I would be kind of the prophet of global consciousness in the form of Web 2.0, right, and mediated by technology. But to answer your question very specifically, it was, my wife and I had been talking about having kids. She was saying, about six. She was 7 years older than I was, and she was ready before I was. I was 24, and I basically said, one day I said, I'm ready. She'd been saying, let's have kids. And I said, okay, I'm ready. And the very next day, I still remember it, these three things happened on the same day. And it was almost like a sign. One of them, I guess the main thing I would just say is, once I decided, it was sort of like, oh, I have to start really being the breadwinner. I have to be a provider. And it was sort of like a light switch got flicked. It was like, wow, daddy juice kicked in. And I had been the three things that happened the day of that decision, or the day after that decision. One, it was not really meaningful, other than just a psychological boost. I had a friend who was dating the Philippine ambassador to the UN. And he was trying to remember a quote from Lao Tzu, and she knew that I was really deeply into Lao Tzu, and so she called me up to say, "Hey, my friend needs this quote for his speech. He's going to give at the UN. Could you do you know what it was?" And it was just kind of cool. Here I am, as this kid being asked, as a source for this speech. That gave me a boost. The other thing was I got approached by another friend to write a book about Frank Herbert, which is the thing that ended up convincing me that I was a writer. And then the third thing was I had this friend who was a programmer who got asked to write a manual. And I said I would help him. And so in some ways it was, like I made the decision, and then magically all the pieces arrived on the table, for me to start assembling the puzzle of my life.
Perhaps you also just had the selective attention.
Yeah.
To spot those things. I've a couple of questions. I don't want to gloss over this. One day I woke up and I said, I am ready. What triggered that? Was there a conversation you had in your head over that cup of coffee that morning? Was there a realization?
No.
What actually led you to proclaim that you were ready?
Let me kind of go back to George Simon, because a lot of what he taught was a kind of mental discipline, and that was rooted in a model of how consciousness happens. And it was sort of framed somewhat in the language of Alfred Korzybski's general semantics. Korzybski had this wonderful diagram that he drew. It was actually a tool that he used to train people. He called it the structural differential. And Korzybski's fundamental idea was that people are stuck in language. But language is about something. And so he represented the process of what he called the process of abstraction, so that people could kind of ask themselves, where are you in that process? And so the structural differential, the first part was a parabola. And the idea was the reason why it's a parabola is because reality is infinite. But we can't take in all of reality. Right? And so hanging from the parabola was a circle. And the circle was our experience, which is our first abstraction from reality. And then hanging from the circle are a bunch of label-shaped tags, like multiple strings of them. And these are the words that we use to describe our experience. And Korzybski's training was for people to recognize when they were in the words, when they were in the experience, when they were open to the reality. And George kind of mixed that in with this work of Sri Aurobindo, who was a Indian sage, and kind of had come up with a model that kind of integrated kind of a spiritual view of this, and a practice which was a kind of just listening, being open to the unknown.
Is that an active? Is that
yes? It's sort of an active thing. It's just like. You can see when somebody is doing it, but it's just like letting go, letting things come in. And then actually if you do it correctly, what starts to happen is you start feeling things and you don't really know what they are. They don't match, it's not like, you put your hand on a table and you feel the table, but there's kind of a spiritual energy that you feel. And you sit with it, and eventually ideas form. So this actual process that was described by the structural differential, you can actually use as a spiritual practice. And you're wrestling with a problem like, am I ready to have kids? You're not sitting there down in the labels saying, pros and cons. There are people who do that, right? But using this approach, you simply say, let me pose this as a problem to this infinite universe. And let me sit in an attitude of receptivity and listen till an answer comes. And I think this is what a lot of people mean by prayer. But it's really interesting to put it in the context of perception, because this same process happens in the real world. It is what happens. There's these things outside you, and you don't really look at them. You don't take them in. And then, so basically the answer is, I kind of said, am I ready? I just had this attitude of openness, and this internal process that goes on. And then one day it just crystallizes, and the label that hangs off that moment, the first label, is I'm ready. And then the next label is, here are these things that I'm going to do.
So I am fascinated by this. Did you pose the question? And I have a number of friends, Josh Waitzkin, who's best known as the inspiration for the book and the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, who's thought of as a chess prodigy, but is a lot more than that. Reid Hoffman also has a similar approach to journaling, where they will pose a question to themselves the day or the night prior to when they journal in the morning. For you, did you pose this question at a particular time when and maybe there are is this something that you have used in other places?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, I mean, at that particular time, when I was younger and closer to that as a big part of my daily work, I think it was just sort of a natural outflow. I mean, at the time, what I was doing for a living was actually teaching these techniques. So it was sort of, I lived and breathed this stuff. But it's continued to be this key part of my life. Whenever I'm confronted with a problem, you find yourself wrestling and you go, oh, wait, I'm just rearranging the labels.
Could you give me a real world example from your life? Or a hypothetical, specific example?
Let me give you a very, a specific business example. It's not quite the same in that it wasn't, kind of this explicitly inner process, but it was certainly an outgrowth. Well, actually, it was an inner process. I take it back. So I had, and this is my contribution to the evolution of the open source movement. So I was sitting there, and I had been part of this Unix community and this internet community, and I noticed something. And what I noticed was that the people, for the most part, the people that I knew from Unix, which is really represented by people who were around this community, this conference called Usenix, and then the people from the internet who were would meet over at the IETF, with relatively few exceptions, didn't overlap, right? And that they did overlap in my life because I was publishing books about, both work coming out of both of these communities. And I thought, I want to bring them together. But something was stopping me. I had this idea. I wanted to get people from the Unix community, and I started thinking about it, and I kept delaying and delaying and delaying, and it was like there was something that was not letting me do it. And then Netscape announced that they were going to release what later became Mozilla as free software. And I went, damn, I'm too late. I've done this. I should have, kind of moved on this sooner. It's now starting to become a story about, free software and why it's important. And then that kicked me into gear, and I organized this event that I first called the Freeware Summit, where I invited in people from all these different communities. And it was at that meeting that Eric Raymond said, well, we were at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and Christine Peterson came up with this new name, open source software, because free software has these problems, as a name, and we voted on it and all agreed to use free software as open source software as this name. And I'd organized a press conference at the end of the day, even though I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And we kind of, I put people up on this stage and said, look at all these guys. They all have dominant market share in these interesting categories of software, and they all have this thing in common. They give their software away for free, and we've come together and we've decided on a new name for it. We're calling it open source software. And the thing that was sort of interesting about that was, first of all, yes, I noticed that something was wrong in the map of the world. That basically people who were talking about free software were only talking about Linux. And there was this whole other world of free software over on the internet side that was left out because the dialogue was, about, the battle against Microsoft and the PC and so on. And so I just kind of, so I was just sitting with it, and trying to think about what to do. And that sitting, that attitude of receptivity. It was something very similar that kind of happened in some sense. One day, this thing happened. It was I sometimes use the analogy of you're doing a puzzle and you can't solve it, and then somebody dumps new pieces on the table, right? And then you go, oh, there, that one fits right in, and that's exactly what happened there. But that waiting is this part of the psychological process. Like if you're sort of if you kind of have this engineering mindset, well, we're just going to go and work with all the pieces that we have. You may not get to the right answer, and so this receptivity to the unknown, and I actually often think of Socrates in this regard. He referred to something he called his daimon, just like listening to this inner voice that would tell him yes or no. I also think there's this great line that recurs continually in my favorite translation of Lao Tzu, The Way of Life According to Lao Tzu by Witter Benner, and the line is, he has his no and he has his yes. And listening to that no and that yes. So, I had this no about I'm not ready to have a child. And then one day I had a yes. And I had this no, I'm not ready to bring all these people together. And then I had a yes. And the fact that there's this, like I had no way of knowing that this new term had been introduced. But if I had had my meeting a month earlier, the term open source software would not have been there to be picked up at my meeting. And it's a mystery. Why is it that like I didn't know that, but something stopped me, and I was kind of kicking myself. But like listening to that inner voice, I just said, no, I'm not. And then one day it's like, yes, he has his no, and then he has his yes. Or she has her yes.
So I think that you and I might, I don't know if you drink alcohol, but if you do, then maybe this is more of a conversation for several bottles of wine. But
I do.
What,
I love wine.
What I'm about to bring up. So you mentioned Odysseus, aka Ulysses, and the sort of a god planting an idea or a desire in his liver, right? And then you have flash forward to, I think you had mentioned Plato and grappling with this concept of justice, and then what seemed mystical now being part of the norm. Is our consciousness evolving, or looking back at the framework that you were discussing with the parabola, then abstraction, so we have reality, then an abstraction of experience, then a further abstraction of language, are we just getting further from reality? Or are they the same thing? Evolving consciousness and getting further from that direct experience of greater reality?
Well, I think it's different. I mean, when you say we, if you mean all of humanity, I think we're all, rediscovering, that process in our lives. I think societies can get further or closer. Individuals can get further or closer. But I think as a whole, we have, in fact, taken in more and more of that parabola. The circle has gotten bigger, and the useful, labels have gotten bigger. Also, many of them have gotten, things that get mislabeled. But if you think, and this was sort of another piece of what I learned from George Simon, and it really was this idea that is our work. Our work is to take in more of the unknown and to bring it into our experience and to bring it into our knowledge. And there's always more. George used to have this great formulation. He referred to God as et cetera, all the rest.
I love it.
Yeah, and I love that, and it's just sort of, for me, it's a useful, not just mental construct, but psychological construct. And it comes up for me, the way I, when I have an idea like this, I just see it everywhere. It used to be this, I mean, still is, I think, this mock tarot deck called Morgan's Tarot.
I've never seen it.
Which was popular in the 70s. I don't know if it's still available anywhere. But it had these fabulous cards, and my favorite card was always the one. It was basically a blank card with the caption, "Always remember this." Always remember, and it was just that moment of just listening to the silence. And, when you have that ability to listen to the silence, you also have the ability to, take things in a different way and see the world fresh. So that I think about Morgan Sterrow, but I also think about Wallace Stevens, one of my favorite poets. An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. We keep coming back and back to the real, to the hotels, and not to the hymns that fall on it out of the wind. Reality is the beginning, not the end. The naked alpha, not the hierophant omega. He's kind of talking about the way that our mind endlessly elaborates on, what he calls the eyes. The eyes plane something, the vulgate of experience. And there's also a great line, a poem is the cry of its occasion, a part of the thing and not about it. This dialogue between the mind and the stuff that we engage with in the world, is our life.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's so many directions we could go. I'm going to tie this into a later question, but I wanted to flash back to Frank Herbert. You mentioned the name in passing. You wrote, as you mentioned, you had an opportunity to write a biography. Correct me if I'm wrong, but of Frank Herbert, who's the author of the Dune series.
Yeah,
Dune is one of those fiction books, the first Dune, that shaped a lot of how I look at the world in some pretty wide-reaching ways. Why did you decide to undertake that? Were there any lessons that you took away from studying his life or his work?
Again, it was complete serendipity. When my friend Dick Riley asked me, would I write this book? He had been appointed the editor of this new series of critical monographs of detective novelists and science fiction novelists. I first said, I wanted to write about Samuel Delany, who was at the time my favorite, writer, because I loved a little book of his called Empire Star, which was, as you might expect, about the nature of consciousness. And Dick was the one who said, no, I think a book on Herbert, will do much better. You should really do. And I had loved Dune. Well, I have a very funny story about it, going back to my childhood. I think I read it when I was 12, and I got it from the library. And I remember my dad picked me up from the Lake Merced Library in San Francisco. I always used to get, you could check out 8 books, and I would get 8, big books. And, he looks at this and he says, it's sinful that so large a book should be devoted to science fiction. And so I couldn't quite bring myself when I wrote the Frank Herbert book to dedicate it to my father with that. Anyway, I was really grateful to Dick because, I had loved Dune, but getting deeper into it and spending time with Frank, it was definitely one of, he was the other. I've had multiple fathers in my life, which is a wonderful thing. People who've kind of helped, shape me, and it does, make me think that, one of the things that, is so missing in our culture is that we don't have enough fathers.
I agree.
Enough mothers, sort of like when you think about, how we were meant to be raised, in these communities. The sort of the nuclear family is kind of a crime against humanity. And that's a strong word, but just like, how do we build stronger communities? Because I think in my life, how important it was to have people who said, you're special, and I know you deeply, and I see something in you, and just to expect that, like, 2 adult parents are the only people who can do that for you. How do we build richer communities of adults who help model and shape our children? And so I was just super lucky because I had, my own dad, and then I had George Simon, and then I had Frank Herbert, and I had my ex-wife's father, a guy named Jack Feldman, who kind of inspired me to think about business, and was just so interested as I built my business. When he died, it was almost like I had been leaning on this wind, and I almost fell over, because it was just like I hadn't realized just how much his continued interest was feeding me. It's like, and the love and interest we can give to other people is such a gift.
Did you spend, and I apologize that I don't know this, but I suppose it'd be boring if I knew all the answers to my questions for this. Did you spend time with Frank Herbert, or was it?
Oh yeah, I did. Yeah, and it was funny because I met with him 2 or 3 times when I was writing. I did 2 books. The first book was this, critical biography, which is really about his books as much as about his life. And it only went up through Dune Messiah. None of the later Dune books had been written at that point, which is fortunate because they were just basically, he was kind of milking the
milking the golden
franchise.
Yeah.
But whereas the first 3 books were really conceived of as a whole from the beginning. And then the second book was a collection of his essays. So I basically, which I edited and interviewed. So I interviewed him on the road for the first book. He would, be at some science fiction convention and so on. So I interviewed him 2 or 3 times, I think, in that period. And what was sort of frustrating was I wanted to get below the surface. He was sort of like, he was a brilliant conversationalist, and he kind of would, just very inspiring ideas about how we have to live on the edge of crisis, and it's what keeps us alive. And, he was just a fount of fascinating ideas. And, so it was scintillating stuff that, if you could do these interviews, that, you could publish them immediately, but I kind of wanted to get under the surface and learn more about who he was and how he thought. But I couldn't, because he was sort of because he was on tour, right? And then when I did the second book, where I was like, I need some more of these sort of Frank on fire interviews. I went to his home in Port Townsend, Washington. We hung out for a couple of days, and he was just mellow and relaxed, and I kind of learned I got to know him, and but it wasn't all this great material. It was sort of like I got the interviews in the wrong order. So anyway, but he was a really wonderful guy who, thought very deeply about the world, had, very prescient ideas about the things that, continue to bedevil us today. I think of many great lines, from his books all the time. Yeah. So
fear is the mind killer.
Yes.
The Bene Gesserit. There's so many good lines. Yeah. If you were to, so I was a nonfiction purist for a very, very long time, for decades. I'm embarrassed in retrospect to admit this, but I was of the mind for a very long time that if I wanted to make stuff up, I could do that in my own head, and I wanted to actually learn things by reading nonfiction. Now I've realized how, at least for me, how off that was, and how many deep truths are better transmitted through fiction. Yeah. For nonfiction addicts who are willing to have an intervention and read a few fiction books, are there any that you would suggest, that you might suggest people start with?
Oh, that's so tough.
Or to make it less pressured, a few of your favorites.
Well, there's certainly, books that have sort of shaped my life. I mean, Dune, definitely one of them. I highly recommend that. There's another fantasy book. It's not really fantasy in the sense of heroic fantasy that people think. Is a book called Islandia, written. It was actually a personal passion project of a Boston lawyer named Austin Tappan Wright. It's just an imaginary world. It was probably the closest analog in the real world is New Zealand. It was this pastoral country somewhere in the southern hemisphere that had been closed off to Western civilization. The guy started writing it in like 1910, and he died in a car accident in 1930 or so. And in the mid 40s, 43 I think it was, his daughter had carved out of his writings about this imaginary world, this book Islandia, which was published and actually made it up to, I think, number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. And it was rediscovered in the 70s, which is when I came across it. A wonderful guide to kind of the values of, living a slower life, because it's all about this guy who's, his roommate at Harvard, class of '06, was a was from Islandia, and so he learns to speak Islandian. And then when they're trying to open up the country, he gets tapped to become the consul, and he's sort of struggling with, the kind of like the modern way of life versus this Islandian way of life. And a lot of people I've tried to give it to find it too slow. But what a rich cornucopia of wisdom is in that book. In terms of classics, I mean, you can't do better than Jane Austen. I mean, for understanding, the human soul. I still remember discovering Pride and Prejudice. I think I was 14, and I was a little embarrassed to be reading what I thought was as a girl book.
For sure.
But it was like so good. And in a similar vein, I've come to love Anthony Trollope because he's like, let's get this plot stuff out of the way. I just want to talk about the people, And you read a book like The Warden, and you kind of go, oh my God, I am reading a novel about the moral quandaries of an 1850s British cleric, and it's freaking fascinating. I think of another book that I read. What was it called? Night Train to Lisbon. And this is not, I wouldn't say is in that same category, but sometimes it's just a line in a book. And this was, that just changed my life in some ways. It came at a critical juncture, and when I was, and the line was, given that there is so much in all of us, what happens to the rest?
Ooh.
And that kind of moment of because that hit this sort of very deep part of me, like where when I was a teenager, I used to have this fantasy that like I could live multiple lives, but I didn't want to just kind of have a different life. I wanted to have multiple lives all at the same time. I wanted to be this multiplex person who could be, be multitudes.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would just highly recommend in addition to fiction is poetry. I mean, the thing that changed my life with regard to poetry, I'm not sure why it was, but when I was a junior in high school, I decided I wanted to get poetry, and I just picked up the collected poems of William Butler Yeats, and I read the entire book. It's 300 or 400 pages of poetry, and the two things that I learned from that were, one, how to read poetry, because a lot of people just are unfamiliar with kind of the stylized form. But more than that, what I learned was, most of 20 of them do nothing for me, and then there's one that just goes bang. And and so learning that and so many people don't learn to love poetry because they've been force fed 19 poems, and they never got to that 20th poem.
Such a good point. That's such a good point. I not to interject, but I resisted poetry for far longer than I resisted fiction, which is saying a lot. And then interviewed actually a friend of mine, Rolf Potts, who wrote a wonderful book called Vagabonding, which I took around the world for me for 18 months in 2004, 2005. And he suggested a few starter books for poetry. And later I ended up picking up a fantastic Rumi collection.
Oh, yeah.
By, I think, Coleman Barks, I want to say the name is.
Yeah, Coleman Barks. Yeah. Exactly.
And the introduction alone to that book will make the hair stand up on your arms. If you have hairy arms, maybe somewhere else otherwise. And I found, when I asked a very good friend of mine who's a huge Rumi fan, how should I read Rumi? He said exactly what you just said. He said, you need to read a lot of them because for me, it's every 15th or every 20th that just really grabs me and I know is going to stick with me. So not expecting that you're going to get or like every single one of them. Are there any places that you would suggest people potentially start when it comes to poetry?
Well, I think you pick up a good one. I actually, my exposure to Kabir and Rumi came through Robert Bly. I love Robert Bly's Kabir book. Although I like Coleman Barks a lot as well. Not as fond of the Stephen Mitchell editions. But there's just good collections of poetry, immortal poems of the English language, or, personally, maybe it's too intellectual for most people, but Wallace Stevens, go find a couple of poems of Wallace Stevens. If you can't read Of Mere Being or Esthétique du Mal and come to some like, oh my God, that's magical, then, again, he's particularly difficult because actually, this is where I would start. East Coker by T.S. Eliot. Oh my God, that's one of my favorite poems. It's about death and rebirth and unbelievably good.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot's hard to go wrong with.
Yeah.
So I wanted to come back to living multiple lives and having multitudes contained within a single person, because I think you have lived many lives.
Yeah, I do my best. But.
And I have more questions on books, and I'll just give out a teaser. We'll come back to this, but I've heard from reliable sources that you love to read old bestsellers from generations ago that are now long forgotten. So I want to find out why. We're going to come back to that, but since a lot of people listening are curious about the edge that you often find. So in 1993, you launched the Global Network Navigators, I understand it, the first web portal, first site to be supported by banner ads. And
no, let me correct you on that. Not banner ads. Banner ads came 2 years later.
Okay.
The very first ads were much closer to Yellow Page ads, and the reason was that there were only 200 websites, right? So we basically were like, hey, we can put content for you on the web. So it was much closer to putting up a website than it was to putting up a banner ad.
I got it. Okay.
Banner ad didn't come until there were enough websites that you could point people somewhere else.
Good point. That's a very good point. And the AOL bought it in 95, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Why do you think you were the first or one of the first to recognize this opportunity, meaning ad-supported web portal?
Well, first of all, I should be clear that I came up with the ad-supported part. Dale Doherty, who was one of my key people at O'Reilly Media for many years, went on to actually start Make Magazine and Maker Faire, and we spun out that into a separate company called Maker Media, was the one who kind of discovered the World Wide Web for us. And it was really following earlier threads in our business. Dale had been very, very interested in online publishing. In 1987, he had created our first ebook, which was a hypercard version of a book I had created called Unix in a Nutshell. And so he'd been pursuing ebooks, and he'd started something. Actually, I may have the timing wrong, but I think it's right. So we had been basically trying to figure out how to. We had these books on something called the X window system. And we started working, this is before XML existed, it was something called SGML, Standard Generalized Markup Language, which is before the web. And we were trying to figure out how to represent our books, for online publishing. And there was a piece of pattern recognition that I had done, which was, there's starting to be a lot of commercial software products for reading books. But I felt like we needed a standard of some kind for our online content, because we weren't going to be a software company, but we wanted everybody to be able to read the same content. This was sort of inspired by, we were a documentation consulting company, and we'd worked with this guy who had to maintain 200 different versions of his software, right? And we were like, screw this, so because we had all these people who were coming to us, because our X books had been adopted as their documentation by a bunch of, Unix workstation companies, and HP had Answer Book, and, Sun had Info Explorer, and, so there were like 5, 6, 7 different kind of, and we said, no, we want to have one format that everybody reads. And so Dale had started working on developing that format, which came to be called DocBook. And it was really for representing technical books in a markup language. But then we realized, and one of the things that we learned from the X window system, this is Bob Scheifler had kind of taught us this. He said, look, what we really are, the way that we use free software, this is a big contrast to, how, Linux grew up, was simply, we're trying to build a reference not even a reference implementation, a sample implementation that people can improve on. And so we had this idea that we needed a free book browser. All right? And Dale discovered this tool called Viola, which was really the first graphical web browser, and that led him to the web. And then, Dale introduced me to Tim Berners-Lee, and Dale was like, we were just publishing our first book about the internet, book called The Whole Internet User's Guide Catalog, which we published in 1993, or 1992, fall of 92. And it had a catalog in the back of interesting internet sites. If you telnet to this site, you'll get earthquake information. If it was Gopher, the web. Dale was the one who said, we got to have the web in here. There were only 200 websites, and the editor, Mike Lukides, actually wrote a chapter at the last minute right before publication, so we could slip it in. But then Pei Wei, who was he was a student at the time, the guy who had written Viola, said, well, I could make a cool demo for the catalog in the back of the book. And the catalog was, it was kind of this list of a couple hundred interesting sites on the internet that people could try out. And so he built this thing, and it was basically a point and click catalog of the early internet. And I said, Pei, that's not a demo, that's a product, And so our first idea was that the internet was still very early. So our first idea was we were going to build a kiosk so people could try the internet using this point and click interface. And so that was what we built. And then Dale wanted to build a magazine, kind of like what Make Magazine became for the maker movement, about the early people of the web. And I said, and he originally thought of it as a quarterly magazine. I said, no, actually, Dale, I think people are going to have the web open on their, they'll be looking at the web every day, So we have to have it constantly updated. And we kind of brainstormed back and forth, and we kind of developed. So there was the catalog component, which was part of what we were doing, and then kind of articles about the people behind this, this new thing. And I was just kind of looking at my desk one day, and we followed the industry through these print magazines, and the way they worked was there were articles and there were ads, and there was this bingo card in the middle, which is this card with, kind of like this giant matrix of numbers, like a multiple choice exam, and you would circle 82, and the ad or the article, corresponding to number 82 would send you a package in the mail.
I remember those, sure.
And I thought, that's really inefficient. We could do that on the web, so people, we could deliver the information directly. So that was the original vision. And it's sort of funny. So the advertising that we invented for the web was really the website, the commercial website, because up to that point, there were no commercial websites. And so the banner ad was this much later layer. It was simply the idea that you could build a commercial website that advertised your product or service and gave you information about it. So the very first ad we did was effectively a website for our law firm, within GNN. It was because we didn't set up the entire website, but it was literally, just here's Heller, Ehrman, White, and McAuliffe. Here's what we do. Here's how to reach us, it was an ad. So we had this sort of directory, catalog. We had this sort of, hey, here are all these cool sites, and now here's the commercial catalog.
So I wanted to just confirm something about the Whole Internet User's Guide and Catalog. So this book you mentioned, 92, and in a piece titled "The Oracle of Silicon Valley," I think this is in Inc. There's a description of one of your marketing approaches. And it says, to market a general interest book from a small publisher about a relatively obscure topic, O'Reilly devised a novel marketing strategy. He would turn himself into an activist. He hired the former director of activism from the Sierra Club and devised a campaign that treated the adoption of the internet like the effort to save the rainforests. He mailed copies of the book to every member of Congress and then went on a media tour in New York City and Washington, D.C., and then this is a quote from you, I was saying, the internet is coming, he says. And O'Reilly Media had the only book that could explain it to you. Is there anything that you would add to that? Anything you would correct? It's a fascinating story,
Yeah.
but that's all I have.
As is the case in so many of these stories, this sort of the hero story, it wasn't my idea to do that. It was this guy, Brian Irwin. We had hired Brian Irwin from the Sierra Club, and we were able to hire. We were up in Sebastopol. He was actually commuting down to San Francisco, and there's a company up here that might be interesting. And then he came in and he said, he's the one who taught me about activism. It wasn't like I had this idea. It was like, no, Brian was this master of activism, and he invented early internet marketing, and he's kind of one of the unsung heroes. He was the one who said, first of all, what he said to me is like, people are not going to care about our book. We want to make them care about the internet. And that was where really he taught me about marketing as activism, about big ideas. And he was the one who said, we're going to go do a press tour about the internet. And he also, gave away, copies of the internet to, people who were on Usenet, really kind of pioneered a lot of influencer marketing techniques. This is 1992. He's kind of it's sort of sad that he has not gotten his enough credit. I always try.
What was his name again?
Brian Irwin.
How do you spell his last name?
Erwin.
All right.
And he's in. I think he's still. He left the company around 2000, and he's. I think he's a marketing consultant still living in Santa Rosa.
All right. I'll track him down and send a link his way. The observation that you brought up about the cards in the magazines, where you circle number 82, that's really inefficient, right? So this
that's right.
Also kind of relates to the how can we make X easier for people? So could you, these types of questions or heuristics are interesting to me. And I'd love if you could elaborate a bit. I actually don't know this name, I'm embarrassed to say, but Hal Varian and his observation that if you want to understand the future, just look at what rich people do today.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, first off, Hal first came into my ken because he was the chief economist at Google. He was the guy who figured out a bunch of things about the Google ad auction that made Google such an economic powerhouse. So, but it turns out he wrote the textbook on microeconomics that almost every economist learned from. So, he's made that comment famously, and I remember talking with him one night. It was dinner with me and Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson, the authors of The Second Machine Age and Machine Platform Crowd. And Carl Shapiro, the guy with whom Hal had written a book called Information Rules. He'd been one of Hal's grad students when he was teaching at Berkeley. And Carl had just been at the White House. And he was sort of reacting with horror at this statement of Hal's. It's like, it sounds like, oh my God, this is the worst Silicon Valley libertarian kind of observation, and it's very easy for people to react that way to it. But yet, if you think about it, it's like, who first owned automobiles? Rich people. Who first owned cell phones? Rich people. Rich people used to fly, or not fly. They would do the grand tour of Europe. Now soccer hooligans follow their team around Europe. And their whole, rich people used to eat out. Now everybody eats out. It's like more people eat out than cook. And so it really is a really interesting tool for thinking and tool for seeing. And I think that's kind of like such a key concept for me is, people, and this kind of goes back to the structural differential and people kind of trying to, judge ideas against other ideas as it's some kind of zero-sum game. And it's like, no, all of these things, reality is infinite. Reality is far more than any of the nets we weave to catch it in, right? So if you accept that, then you kind of go, these are simply tools to help us see. And so I go, does this help me see? Yes. And so, for example, in my forthcoming book, there's a whole chapter that's in some ways based on this, which is, it's called Why We'll Never Run Out of Jobs. And it's because, you look at what happens in rich societies and how basically commodity products get elaborated in more and more ways. So, think about craft beers that are more expensive than commodity beers. Think about specialty coffees that are more, expensive than commodity coffee, right? And what's added? In a lot of ways, it's a story that's added. And yes, sure, the story has physical components. This came from this coffee. Is actually Alexis Madrigal's Containers podcast is fabulous on this subject. And episode 4 is about the history of sort of the evolution of the coffee market. But this coffee came from this particular coffee plantation in Guatemala. And all the things that have to come into place to make that bring that to a particular coffee roaster, and they tell that story. And as a result of that story and the reality that goes with the story, that this is actually a unique flavor, of course, if it doesn't match, if it doesn't deliver, then people go, not much to the story. But if it delivers, then people, yes, they will pay more. And so this is why I believe that, as we commoditize labor, or one of the reasons, I should say, with AI, with robots, we can find new things for people to do. There's 3 things. First of all, again, this is a major theme of my book, which we haven't really talked about. But
let's get into it.
One is there's plenty of work to do, for Christ's sake. So the big question is not, we talk too much about jobs and not enough about work. Because if we focused on what work needs doing, then we start to ask, what's keeping us from doing that work? And we realize that there's something broken in our economic system that's diverting our energy and investment away from doing the work that needs doing towards, financial gains, and people who are sort of extracting money from the economy without actually getting the work done that we need doing. So that's one piece. But the second thing is obviously, there's all this work being done that is not being compensated for. Now, I have this sort of metaphor. It originally came to me in the context of open source software, but it really entered my consciousness as a mental tool in the 70s when I read it in Stuart Brand's Coalition Quarterly. It was a concept called the clothesline paradox, which is there's things that simply disappear from our economic accounting. So you think about in the clothesline paradox, it really was like, okay, we're measuring solar energy versus renewables versus fossil fuels, and if somebody puts their clothes in the dryer, it's fossil fuel usage, but if somebody takes their clothes and put them on the line, it doesn't accrue to the solar column.
Right.
And and I kind of made an analogy from that to open source software, which sort of disappeared from our economic accounting for so long before people like Google and Amazon figured out how to build enormous businesses on top of it. But if you look at our economy today, it's like taking care of people, mostly uncompensated, a lot of creativity, poorly compensated. It's like, why is it, if these things that are so valuable don't get paid for, right? They're sort of they're taken out of the economic paradigm. We need to fix that, and it's not necessarily saying, well, thou must pay for this, because the people all have supply and demand. There's all kinds of hacks that societies have used to value things differently. Just a good example is child labor. How did we didn't start saying, well, we have to pay children more. We said, no, we're going to stop using them for this thing, right? And that actually reduced the workforce, that we reduced working hours. And what did we do with that? We sent them to school, right? We actually paid as a society to send kids to school. And then later, we don't need all these teenagers on the farms anymore. Oh, let's send them to school. Let's and then the high school movement started around 1909. 9% of Americans went to high school in 1909. By 1935, it was about 70%. It's like this amazing social revolution. So what is it that we could do today around like, okay, let's actually, it doesn't have to be that we start paying people. It could be that we do universal basic income, but we somehow need to revalue some of the things, education, creativity, caring in our economy. And again, in that whole creativity economy, you have to understand that economy writ large is wrapped up in that Hal variance statement, because if you look, I mentioned coffee and beer, but just food in general. 2% of our population now, in the U.S. works in agriculture, right? Yet we have more variety of food than we ever had in the day when we all worked in agriculture. That design pattern is what we need to be exploring, to make our economy. We need to basically say, let's figure out what kinds of things become valuable as other things become commoditized, and let's start valuing them appropriately.
Is the decision to value something appropriately, what are some of the drivers of that change potentially? I mean, you have market demand, right? So there could be just, for instance, you have an Uber or something like that, and all of a sudden this potential excess inventory or idle time of resource X can be valued differently, or people devalue owning cars, for instance. You have regulatory, right? So in the case of, say, child labor, you can change the rules of the game, so to speak, so that the incentives are different. What are some of the other drivers, and are there any particular examples of things that rich people are doing now that you think are going to be commonplace and much more widely adopted?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that clearly that most rich people do that are, could become a big driver of the economy is experiences. You were talking about, hiking in Uzbekistan with Kevin Kelly. It's like most people don't get to do things like that. But just the experience economy writ large, I think, is, and that's everything from new kinds of food, new kinds of, I think we're going to have a lot in augmented reality. There's already a lot in social media. It's new kinds of experiences, new kinds of learning, learning is a huge, it's like teaching people to enjoy learning and to always be learning new things. There's an economy in that. And the things that I think policy-wise that we need to start thinking about is, first of all, we have a lot of economic policies that reward non-productive investment. What do I mean by non-productive investment? It's sort of summed up pretty beautifully in the tale of GE, where Jeff Immelt was, recently forced out. GE sort of said, "Oh no, he meant to retire. I don't buy it." It was basically an activist investor, bought a stake in the firm, started agitating for, share buybacks, right? And among other things. And the thing that's so amazing, they wrote this white paper in 2015, and it describes in detail what a great company GE is. They have bigger market share than their competitors in these categories. They're growing faster. They're getting more focused, and it's like this amazing, story of how GE is succeeding in the real economy. And then they go, but the stock price has lagged, we must fix the stock price, and the way that, they should do these various, things, they need to spin this out. And some of those things might be rational, but they should also borrow money. And, basically, when you buy back shares, it reduces the number of shares, so the earnings per share go up, and since stocks are often, priced as a multiple of earnings per share, stock price goes up. So GE should borrow $20 billion to make the stock price go up. Who benefits from that? GE doesn't need that. GE's customers don't need that. Investors benefit. And it turns out that at this point, 85% of all investment in our economy is of this kind. It's for the benefit of investors. Warren Buffett put it really well in this quote from Rana Foroohar's wonderful book, Makers and Takers, which is all about this sort of financialization of the economy. And he says, he told her, sometimes people prefer to go to the casino than the restaurant. and we have built an economy that is largely a casino. And this is why, I think both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders played on this, and people know there's something wrong, and our government has basically been supportive of this paper economy, and they're wringing their hands. But there's this failed idea, and this is kind of brings me back to my book, which,
the title of which is WTF, right? What's the future and why it's up to us?
Yeah, and the why it's up to us is the key part, because there's this sense of technological determinism, that I revolt against. This idea that technology inevitably wants to eliminate jobs. I believe, that technology wants to solve new problems. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the incentives that we've created in our system? So the book is really, in some ways, it's an economic polemic wrapped in a business book, wrapped in a memoir. And the memoir starts with kind of my experiences, dealing with and thinking about, the great platforms of the computer industry, starting with Microsoft. And what I saw was that Microsoft took too much of the value for themselves. People deserted their ecosystem and went elsewhere to the internet. And then I've watched the story replay itself as, Google and, Facebook, and Twitter and so on have competed with their developer ecosystem and made it less of a good place to be. And, that lesson seems to be lost. And then of course, by extension, I've seen, that's also how our financial markets, which were originally designed as a sort of enabling platform for the economy and for society, have ended up trading against society, taking too much of the value for themselves. And so it's this sort of ecosystem view, of platforms, and actually also in the book, it's kind of interesting seeing how I hate the books are slower than the modern media, because I was kind of saying, I kind of call it a little bit on Lyft versus Uber, because I say, look, they are creating more value for their ecosystem of drivers, and that really matters in the long run. And sure enough, I mean, Lyft is really gaining on Uber because Uber's extractive business model has sort of caught up with them.
So, as a question for you, I have so many questions, of course, but you have, and this is related, I think, to what you just said. So you've built, you're somewhat of an anomaly in the Silicon Valley area, in the sense that you built a profitable business with several $100 million in revenue without any venture capital.
That's right.
The slogan is what I'd love to touch upon. We can take this in any direction you'd like, but how did you come up with the slogan? And maybe you could give some backstory: create more value than you capture.
That's actually Brian Irwin again. It was his last gift to the company. We had a management retreat in 2000, and I think I told the story. I won't mention the name, but actually more than one internet. I said, more than one internet billionaire has told me that they got started, with, their whole business with, what they learned from an O'Reilly book. And Brian laughed and he said, "Yeah, that should be our slogan. We create more value than we capture."
So that's how it came up.
And of course, we all went, "Yes,"
Why is that? Now you've had, as I understand it, discussions with Eric Schmidt about "Don't be evil." It's a Google slogan. Yeah. What do you think of that slogan? Is that sufficient? Is it?
Well, the thing that the problem I have, and again, I mean, this was we were at Google Zeitgeist and we had a conversation in the lobby. It wasn't like we had this profound, deep, but I was trying to say, look, don't be evil isn't measurable. Create more value than you capture is measurable. And and it is. And again, I expand on this quite a bit on my book. That this idea of, when you have a system, whether it's a platform or an economic system, that creates more value, or an ecosystem. This kind of goes back to Frank Herbert and what I learned from him. When you have an ecosystem, it has to actually, create value for all its participants, and you have to be able to measure that. And we need to actually start thinking about, as a society, how we measure more holistically the ecosystem value that gets created. Because what we've done is we've created a set of measures that are focused exclusively on one set of market participants, which is really the market owners. If you think about, what the stock market is about, it's about the people who own the systems, the companies. And we've just, we've sort of forgotten that, the financial markets are a map of our expectations of what's supposed to be happening in the real economy. And instead, we're just kind of manipulating the map and kind of go, well, and hoping nobody notices that the real economy is going to shit, while we're telling ourselves this great story. And I think that figuring out, are there other measures? Clay Christensen's also written about this. He's the author of his original book was, The Capitalist Dilemma. I'm sorry, not The Capitalist Dilemma, The Innovator's Dilemma, but he has a paper he wrote, and I believe there may be a book now called The Capitalist Dilemma, which is really about this question of, we started measuring the wrong things. And, effectively we started measuring, a small subset of the things we ought to be measuring about the health of the economy.
So what's, and maybe this is related, maybe not, so feel free to tackle this in whichever order. So I guess what I would love to ask is, what should we measure? But I've read that you think the financial markets might well be the first rogue AI. So why do you feel that way, and what should we do about it? And maybe that relates to the measurement. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that this is sort of an extended metaphor at the core of the book. I'm trying to sort of explain what I learned from platforms. And so I kind of look at, for example, at Google and the way they manage search quality. And you kind of understand that even though they have this, cornucopia of algorithms, including, AI, it's all serving a master fitness function. The thing that they're trying to optimize towards, in this case, is relevance, whether it's the relevance of a search result or the relevance of an ad. And, and it's this sort of constant battle against bad actors, against new, you're trying to deal with new information, but you're always trying to optimize towards that goal. So then I look at Facebook and kind of go, okay, so we see that they have a related but somewhat different fitness function. Google's fitness function is we serve you something up, and then you go away, right? Because if you got the real answer, you went away, right? Whereas Facebook's is if we give you the thing that we really want you to get, you come back, right? And you spend more time, right? So it's almost an inverse. But again, they still have this master fitness function. Theirs is, you could describe it as engagement. And I kind of talk through fake news and how you can see how a fitness function can lead you astray. And how Mark right now is sort of saying, oh, wait, the things we told our computer to do, our system, are not what we really meant. And actually, there's a couple of quotes that I can't believe. They've sort of been life quotes for me, and I can't believe that I did not actually put them in the book. One of them was this great quote from Walt Mossberg, the famous tech journalist, who once said to me years ago, he said, I told Steve Ballmer, he said, if you guys could just dial back the greed only 5%, people would like you 100% more, or people wouldn't hate you. And the other one was this, quote about debugging from a guy named Andrew Singer, who was a friend of mine who I haven't seen for many, many years. But he once said to me, he said, debugging is the art of finding out what you really told your computer to do instead of what you thought you told it to do.
So, go ahead.
And in some sense, so see, like right now, Mark is trying to debug the fitness functions of Facebook's engagement paradigm, so that he's talking about real communities. How do we, support more real communities as opposed to these sort of fake manipulative, communities that are contributing to polarization. But when you look at our financial markets, we have that same challenge. We have a master fitness function, and it's sort of interesting to realize that the master fitness function that we had after World War II, in that golden period of the growing middle class, was actually full employment. They were scared shitless because after World War I, all those, they'd seen, first of all, in America, you had, all the returning soldiers who were, homeless, whatever, and all this had led to the Great Depression. We saw all this stuff. I mean, it wasn't just the returning soldiers, but it was, they went into this period where people were out of work. And, they saw what happened in, the rise of Nazism in Germany, and they were really focused on putting people to work, and that was, all of the policy interventions were around that. And then in the, the 70s and 80s, it really, we kind of shifted the fitness function to shareholder value. And kind of if it was good for the stock market, it was good for America. And now we're kind of looking at it and going, oh, that didn't work. And, in some sense, kind of what I'm trying to lay out challenge in the book. I'm trying, a lot of people are saying this, economists, politicians, whatever. I'm just trying to argue, make the another line of argument reasoning from tech and what we learn from tech platforms. That in a similar way, we have to look at what are we telling our economy to optimize for, and realizing that we make choices in that. That the economy, despite all of the ideas of that it's a free market, it isn't at all. It's a designed system, and it has all kinds of rules, just like Google has all kinds of rules for achieving relevance. We have all kinds of rules in our economy that bias it towards the outcomes that we're optimizing for, namely shareholder value. We have tax preferences around capital gains versus how we tax labor. We have rules about whether people can organize. I mean, there's no accident that labor got a bigger share of the pie when labor organizing was supported as opposed to when it's not. And a lot of things went wrong with unions. And that has to be debugged too. We have to rediscover what it means for people to be able to stand up to, the machines that we built. There's, rules about how much people work, how much time off they get. And you can see, that there's different, like just look at German stakeholder capitalism and go, oh, here's a different system with different rules, has different outcomes. You look at, the interventionist, evolution of the economy in countries like South Korea, and you kind of go, yeah, this whole free market thing is just, it's a map, and it's not entirely, it's got some great stuff in it. It's just not the whole picture. Again, goes back to Korzybski. The map is not the territory. So we have to constantly check our map and ask ourselves, are we optimizing for the right things? What rules should we be changing in order to get closer to the outcome we really want? And of course, we have to agree on that outcome. But I think if we want a human-centered future, we can choose that. And again, I kind of end, I think, on an optimistic note, kind of looking at the ways that people are choosing that, and they are, reaching for that better future, working on hard problems, doing, new, inventing new forms of creativity that other people are willing to pay for, and building that wonderful fiction that we have. Now I'm back to poetry. Wallace Stevens had this amazing idea that that reality is actually a fiction that we create for each other.
Boy, yeah. I mean, reality in quotation marks or not seems to be that case.
His great line is, "Reality is an activity of the most august imagination."
One thing that I really love about both reading your work and just speaking with you is how much the new relates to the very, very old and vice versa. And what I mean by that, or even reminds us to re-examine base assumptions. So for instance, I mean, if we look at we could look at the fanciest of high frequency trading, or even some disasters like long-term capital management to see how these systems and humans respond to incentives. And if you don't look at them closely enough, the debugging process can be super, super painful, or how cryptocurrency has made people take a closer look, if they dig in, at what money actually represents. And so I wanted to ask you a question about money, and not on a macroeconomic level, but on a smaller scale. And this is a quote, correct me if I'm getting this wrong. In this quote, money in a business is like gas in your car. You don't want to run out, but you're not doing a tour of gas stations.
That's right.
Yeah. So can you elaborate on that? Because there are people certainly who would disagree, right? They would not say that life should be a tour of gas stations, but they would assert that maybe the function of business is to generate a profit, and at that, as much profit as humanly possible. Can you explain that position? And
well, I mean, I think,
and also, sorry, not to interrupt, but also talk a little bit about you know a lot of very, very, very wealthy people in tech who have, in some cases, come from very meager backgrounds. I'd love to also hear about the mistakes that you see in your mind as it comes to personally, on a personal or familial level, relating to money or dealing with money.
I mean, my own mistakes?
No, well, I think you appear to have a very healthy relationship with this concept of money and money in general. But I'm wondering what we can come back to that. Why don't we start? I'm asking you 7 questions in one, but
let me, I guess I would just sort of say a couple of things. One is, anybody who thinks that money is the object, I'm sad for them, because money is a tool. We want happiness. We want happiness for ourselves. We want it for the people we love. And if we're, great souled, we want it for everybody, and we should want it for everybody, the idea, there is sort of I think, a legitimate debate about the right way to do that. And so, when a lot of people, like if we were talking with Russ Roberts, who's a dedicated, libertarian free marketer, I don't know if you've seen his little film, It's a Wonderful Loaf, about, kind of Adam Smith and his book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. These are all kind of, an encomium to this idea that there's this magic when, people just pursue their own aims, and it magically produces this wonderful goodness of the economy. And I, but those people are not pursuing money. Money is a measure of what they are pursuing. And so I guess, so that's the first piece that I would say. And then, there's sort of, obviously there's lots and lots of studies that, above a certain level, more money doesn't make you happier. I think that, in general, happy and prosperous societies are more egalitarian. Not, it's not flat. I don't think, it's sort of interesting because a lot of people kind of go, well, if people aren't allowed to become as rich as inhumanly possible, then you're sort of somehow cutting off this sort of capitalist impulse. I go, that's not true. I just look in my own history, and I think about the people who drove the industry, when I was young, and what their expectations were about how much money they would make. And I think of titans of the industry, people like, Hewlett and Packard, or, Gordon Moore, and, Andy Grove, and they probably made less money than some punk kid who built and sold a startup that basically vanished as soon as it was sold. We have people who are billionaires who created very, very, very little value, and yet we have somehow upped our, um, sort of our standard of, what it means. It was that great scene in the Social Network, the movie. It was like, oh, $1 million isn't cool. Now $1 billion, now that's cool. And it's just like that's vanity. That's vanity. And I just kind of feel that we, anyway, I mean, I guess I would say there's sort of a set of social issues where, self-interest should tell you that if we don't build a more just and equitable society, this system is going to fall down. There are people in North Korea who are doing very well for themselves. There are people in Venezuela who are doing very well for themselves, right? But the vast majority of people are, living very badly. And that's a failed state. And that's the end game of an economy in which, there's this ferocious competition of some people to get as much as possible. And I think, the goal for all of us should be to create as much value as possible and to capture enough of it, but not all of it. And, and I do think that if you see, there's a lot of wonderful, I mean, one of the things that I do feel like is wonderful about Silicon Valley is there are a lot of people who say, yeah, that's enough. I want to go, do something really valuable. We've tapped into this with Code for America and the United States Digital Service, people who are saying, okay, I'm going to go to government, or we see it in, someone like Jeff Huber at Grail, who says, okay, I'm going to try to develop an early detection test for cancer. It's like, I don't need, to go, make another startup that's going to make a whole bunch of money. Maybe he will make a whole bunch of money, but that's not what he's doing. Or Elon Musk, what a great example. I mean, Elon put his own money at risk, a lot of it, kind of going, I want to do something really hard that's going to really move the needle about making a better world. And he's done it again and again. He, whether right or wrong about, we need to become a multiplanetary species. I think he's right. Other people go, oh, we should be spending the money here on Earth. He's basically, doing something. He's harnessing this machine of the economy, this wonderful machine of capital to do something, and it's, it's like he's become rich as a byproduct of what he's trying to accomplish, which is exactly what I mean by you're not doing a tour of gas stations. Meanwhile, there are people, like those people on Wall Street, leading up to 2000, they knew they weren't creating value. They were simply trying to extract it. They were doing a tour of gas stations. And I have to say, there are too many people in Silicon Valley who are like that. It's sort of funny because I feel like we call people in Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And yes, there are Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. But there are also a lot of people who I think are a lot closer. If you kind of try to draw the right map, they're a lot closer to actors than they are to entrepreneurs. That is, they're going around looking for a project to attach themselves to, which is funded by, it's like substitute, venture capitalist for movie studio, right? And you could say, yeah, an actor's an entrepreneur. Yeah, I mean, they're basically, they have their, they're driving their own career, but they're basically waiting for somebody to give them money to do this thing, And if they don't get the money, so they're really kind of a special kind of hired employee. And, and that's kind of what we're doing with our venture firm. My partner, Bryce Roberts, has really kicked off this thing called Indie VC, which is really about how do you build real businesses? You might need some money to get started, but mainly you want to get funded by customers. Because I've seen all these people in Silicon Valley, and they basically go from failed startup to failed startup, just like, an actor goes from one movie to another.
You seem to be so forward-looking and so often at the lead edge of various trends and changes that become something seemingly obvious in hindsight, right? I mean, you're so forward looking in so many ways. I promised I would come back to this. Why do you read old bestsellers from generations ago?
Well, I mean, really just for fun.
How do you pick them if that's the case?
Well, it is really, again, one of these pattern recognition things. I mean, I first became conscious of it. Must have been maybe close to on 30 years ago. I had dropped my daughter off at a doctor's appointment. And I went for a walk while she was, actually, maybe I had just gone back to the car, and it was starting to rain. And I walked by this bookstore that was going out of business, and they had put all these books out on the street. And there was a box, and it's starting to rain, and I see it was like a box of Zane Grey books, and I saw Riders of the Purple Sage, and I thought, I've heard of that, right? And I couldn't bear to see the books get rained on, so I said, I'm just going to pick them up, put them in my car, and and I'll give them away somewhere else later. But I pulled that book out and I read it and I loved it, because it's this sort of like, oh my God, this guy kind of invented the mythology of the Old West, and I read a bunch of the other Zane Grey books that were in there. And that was kind of, I first started to go, oh, there's something interesting. These, sure, they're still popular in a certain way, but they're super dated, but they're like a time machine into, how people felt, about the world in, like Riders of the Purple Sage, written in, 1915, I think, and then, I started realizing the same thing about other books that I had read, and I, started to seek them out, a lot of it was helped by the fact that my father-in-law at the time had a big library, and I could kind of read in his library, and it's like, oh, it's like, I'd always seen, the Charlie Chan movies, and he has a Charlie Chan novel, by James Earl Biggers, and I go, let me read that. And oh my God, it's like a time machine. It's like the casual racism, it's like, where, people refer to him as the chink, Charlie Chan, but more than that was just this view that the one I read, I forget what the title was, but it was some family from Philadelphia, the daughter has run away to San Francisco and from there to Honolulu, and the view of California, as this distant land that was sort of kind of the wild, literally the Wild West. And then, Honolulu off the edge of the earth, and it's just like this piece of magic where you kind of, see into the past. And then, as I mentioned, Anthony Trollope, you're kind of looking into the depths of life in the Victorian era. But what I find that's sort of interesting, and I started to seek out are books that are largely forgotten because, or they have some piece of them has survived, but they haven't survived. Like everybody knows Charles Dickens, but, only a certain number of people will have read George du Maurier's Trilby, right? But almost everybody knows, well, maybe not everybody, I'm probably showing off too much literary, but they've heard about mesmerism, and they've heard about a Svengali, right? Well, Svengali is a character in George du Maurier's book, right? Trilby, which is, and it's about mesmerism, and the way mesmerism was this sort of hypnotism was this rage through Victorian society, in the 1890s. Everybody was fascinated by it, and it was just, it's like. I guess it'd be a little bit like reading, more recently, Ken Kesey's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, to kind of get us, or something from Thomas Pynchon, kind of getting into the world of psychedelia and that era of the 70s, right? Or for that matter, reading, there will be a time when somebody could read Michael Lewis, Liar's Poker, and it will be a time machine into this, place when, our financial economy went crazily wrong. And guess what? There's actually a novel about that by Anthony Trollope called The Way We Live Now, about, the great railroad bubbles of the 1860s, and so in some ways fiction is also a key part of a way to learn about history in a way that's a little deeper, because one of the things that I think we're not very good at is we rewrite history all the time. So if you read a modern history, you're reading what we think about it now. So you could read an old book of history, but when you read a novel, you are reading how people thought, what they were struggling with. You read a book like another trollop that I love, Can You Forgive Her? It's this sort of proto-feminist novel about these women who made choices that were unconventional in who they would marry, and the fact that was even an issue, but we kind of look back on that, but it's like, oh my God, you can see it, as a moral struggle, and he's kind of trying to set you up to say, yes, you can forgive her, because she didn't marry the socially approved guy, and it's like the fact that like it just gives you a deeper insight into our own world, because one of the things that and this kind of brings me back to, Korzybski, the structural differential, the map is not the territory, my training with George Simon, learning to see our own world in the same way, that, that things that we take for granted will, we will one day look back on, or other people will look back on and say, how quaint. And, and in our own lives, our daily lives, the ability to sort of go, oh, wait, this way that I have always been may not be the only way to be, that I can change. So seeing change is a prelude to being change.
So this I think is a great place to start to wrap up. And I have this question I've been wanting to ask since we started, but I think that the answer will be more impactful now that we've covered a lot of the context. What do? You strike me, and I think many people, as extremely optimistic, extremely upbeat. What do you do, or what have you done when you felt down or been going through periods of darker times? Because there are a lot of people who would like to be change of some type, but they feel intimidated or depressed for whether it's personal reasons or because every time they open the newspaper, it looks like the world is falling apart in every possible respect. Mm-hmm. What do you do when you aren't your usual upbeat, optimistic self, if that happens?
Yeah, well, one of the since I gave homage in the opening to Sesame Street, I have to give a little homage also to the other wonderful teacher of children, Mr. Rogers. And by the way, before I had kids, I thought, Mr. Rogers, this is the stupidest thing ever. Once you have kids, you go, oh my God, this guy was a genius. To me, he was a genius. But anyway, and there's a video of him doing congressional testimony once. I forget what was the reason. It was about the early days of PBS. And you watch this congressman who's sort of hostile in the beginning, just sort of gradually just sort of start nodding and smiling. It's so great. But I digress. But the great thing to your question is this fabulous quote from Fred Rogers, where he said, on his show, he's telling children, when you see bad things happen, look around for the people who are helping. There are always people helping. And, it's just such great life advice. It's like, and I just tweeted something like that the other day, as I had just come across, there was a new video about Planet Labs, one of my companies I'm an investor in. They're trying to image the surface of the earth every day. They call their satellites doves. They said, like, all these military satellites, they all have names of raptors, and we wanted ours to signal that they're for peace. And there's this great piece about their launch of the largest flock of Earth imaging satellites, and I just kind of posted it with I think the tweet was something like, if you need your dose of optimism, watch this video, because here's somebody who's doing something idealistic. Maybe I said your dose of idealism, kind of. So look for people who are helping the world be a better place.
Well, Tim, I think you are one of those people, and we could talk for hours and hours more, but I think, bring this one to a close. But first, so people can find you elsewhere, learn more about you and the book and everything else that you are up to, where would you suggest people find you on the internet?
Well, probably the best place right now is a site called tim.o'reilly.com. It's a subsite of O'Reilly.com, which is our online learning platform, which includes tens of thousands of ebooks from mostly on technology and business topics, but increasingly other things, but also videos, live training. It's really the core of our entire business. But tim.o'reilly.com sort of has it's sort of my personal archive of, for example, a link to this podcast will go on there once it's up. It also points to my book. There will be a site for the book, but it's not up yet. The site will be called WTFeconomy.com. And I think the book is something that it's really covers a lot of the topics we talked about today, but also a lot more. I mean, there's a lot about how you think, how to draw a map of your business model, and how to think about the implications. For example, I spent a lot of time on dissecting the business model of Uber and Lyft, and then saying, what does this teach us about their story about self-driving cars? Like, if you draw a correct map of the world, it tells you something about the future. Mm-hmm. And so, but anyway, so I would say, go to tim.o'reilly.com, and from there you'll find everything else.
And then on best place to say hello on social, would that be at O'Reilly Media or
no at Tim O'Reilly on Twitter.
Tim O'Reilly.
And I do see all my app messages, and also I respond to email, and if you know my name, you can guess my email.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for taking the time. This was really fun for me. And I have a reading list as long as my arm, which I'm prepared to dig into. Yeah. Is there any question or suggested action that you would have for people listening before we completely wrap up?
Well, I guess the biggest advice I would have is sort of try to create a daily practice where you stop thinking and start listening to nothing. And that some people would call that meditation. But it could be just, like when you go, if you go for a run, don't think. Just let things come into your head. If you, sit by a fire or go sailing, those are good activities for letting that happen. Going for a very, very long walk till all the thoughts fall away. Because, cultivating that head space and that soul space where you're not filling it up with the stuff you already have, you already know, but are just listening. It's that Morgan's Tarot card, always remember this, the space that lets stuff come into you and surprise you and give you new thoughts and give rise to curiosity.
I think that is the perfect place to wrap up. Tim, thank you so much again. I really appreciate you taking the time. Everybody should check out everything, including your writing on Medium. You had a great piece on how you separate out fake news from real news that I think should be required reading. So much more that we can dig into. So thank you first and foremost. And to everybody listening, you can find the show notes, so links to everything that we've discussed, including Tim's new book and everything else, in the show notes at tim.blog/podcast, along with every other episode. So just check those out at tim.blog/podcast. And as always, and until next time, thank you for listening. Hey guys, this is Tim again. Just a few more things before you take off. Number one, this is 5 Bullet Friday. Do you want to get a short email from me? Would you enjoy getting a short email from me every Friday that provides a little morsel of fun before the weekend? And 5 Bullet Friday is a very short email where I share the coolest things I've found or that I've been pondering over the week. That could include favorite new albums that I've discovered. It could include gizmos and gadgets and all sorts of weird shit that I've somehow dug up in the world of the esoteric as I do. It could include favorite articles that I've read and that I've shared with my close friends, for instance. And it's very short. It's just a little tiny bite of goodness before you head off for the weekend. So if you want to receive that, check it out. Just go to 4hourworkweek.com. That's 4hourworkweek.com, all spelled out, and just drop in your email, and you will get the very next one. And if you sign up, I hope you enjoy it. This episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. You may have heard them everywhere. They're growing like crazy. They're an innovative platform for doing several things, but especially improving the hiring process, making it slick and elegant and easy. One of the hardest parts of running any business, growing any business, is finding and hiring the right team. I've seen this firsthand in close to 100 startups now. God, I'm getting old. From all over the world at different stages of growth. And nothing can quite drain your resources and cost you time and money like making mistakes in hiring. ZipRecruiter developed their own system and their own platform for helping you to solve two of the biggest problems and bottlenecks for employers: posting jobs easily and then making it even easier to find the best candidates. Unlike other job sites, ZipRecruiter does in effect the opposite of what you'd expect. So they do not depend on candidates finding you. Their technology finds the right candidate for you. And in fact, more than 80% of the jobs posted on ZipRecruiter return a qualified candidate based on your criteria that you select in just 24 hours. So no more juggling email, reviewing hundreds of unqualified candidates. I've been there, done that. Don't recommend it. Or dealing with calls to the office, etc. None of that. Simply screen, rate, and manage your candidates all in one place on ZipRecruiter's dashboard. And as a listener of the Tim Ferriss Show, thanks for that, ZipRecruiter wants to allow you to start posting jobs and trying their services for free. So if you're thinking of hiring somebody, you need to find an executive assistant, you need to find a developer, whatever it might be. Try it out. Just visit ZipRecruiter.com/Tim. And you can experience this episode
just how
ZipRecruiter
Peloton
has been used by businesses
and I'd
of all
heard
different
about
sizes
Peloton
to
over
find
and
the
over
most
again,
qualified
but
job
I ended up
candidates.
getting
a Peloton bike in the whole system after I saw my buddy Kevin Rose. I've known him forever. Some of you know. And he showed up at my gate at my house a while back, and he looked fantastic. And I asked him, I said, dude, you look great. What the hell have you been up to? Because he's always doing a weird diet or another, but it only lasts like a week or two. So he always regresses to the mean after like 75 beers. And he said, I've been doing Peloton 5 days a week. Now that caught my attention because Kevin does nothing 5 days a week. And you know I love you, Kevin. But it really piqued my curiosity. Ended up getting a system, and it's become an integral part of my week. I love it, and I really didn't expect to love it at all because I find cycling really boring usually. But Peloton is an indoor cycling bike that brings live studio classes right into your home. You don't have to worry about fitting classes into your schedule or making it to a studio with some type of commute, etc. New classes are added every day, and this includes options led by elite New York City instructors in your own living room. You can even live stream studio classes taught by the world's best instructors or find your own favorite class on demand. And in fact, Kevin and I rarely do live classes, and you can compete with your friends, which is also fun. Kevin, I'm coming after you. But we usually just use classes on demand. I really like Matt Wilpers and his high-intensity training sessions that are shorter, like 20 minutes. And I think Kevin's favorite is Alex, and everyone seems to have their favorite instructor, or you can select by music, duration, and so on. Each Peloton bike includes a 22-inch HD touchscreen, performance tracking metrics. I think that, along with the real-time leaderboard, are the main reasons that this caught my attention when cycling never had caught my attention before. It's really pretty stunning what they've done with the user interface to keep your attention. The belt drive is quiet and it's smaller than you would expect, so it can fit in a living room or an office. I actually have it in a large closet, believe it or not, and it fits with no problem. So Peloton is offering all of you guys, listeners of the Tim Ferriss Show, a special offer, and it is actually special. Visit One Peloton, that's OnePeloton, onepeloton.com, and enter the code TIM, all caps, TIM, at checkout to receive $100 off accessories with your Peloton bike purchase. Now you might say, meh, accessories? Wait, I don't need fancy towels or whatever other supplemental bits and pieces. No, the shoes you need. You need the clip-in shoes, and those are in the accessory category. So this $100 off is a very legit $100 off. So if you want to get in your workouts, if you want a convenient and really entertaining way to do high-intensity interval training or anything else, or you just want to get a fantastic gift for someone, check out Peloton. OnePeloton.com and enter the code TIM. Again, that's OnePeloton.com and enter the code TIM at checkout to receive $100 off any accessories, including the shoes that you will want to get. Check it out, OnePeloton.com, code TIM.